It's always one of the fun things in class, seeing people come, the participant number.
It is, seeing it just climb
41.
up and up and up. Well, a wonderful, wonderful group of people here. So I'm going to get started. I know we have a really interesting discussion planned today. So as everyone is coming in, again, this is a Zoom webinar. So you don't have to worry about muting yourself or turning your cameras off. We have that all covered. I'm going to touch on this in a second, but along the bottom bar here, you'll be able to see a Q&A feature. So you can enter any of your questions in that Q&A chat as we go along. And then Professor Zimmer and I will pepper the questions into the conversation. We'll also do a little Q&A at the end. But if you have any questions throughout this process, please enter them in the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that. Okay, so we'll get started. So good afternoon. My name is Lucy Chaplin, Associate Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement. On behalf of Connecticut College and the Office of Advancement, I would like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us for Fall Weekend at Home. We have a wonderful audience today of faculty, staff, students, parents, and alumni, ranging from the classes of 1952 to 2024. So I'm joined today by Professor Marc Zimmer. Professor Zimmer is the Gene C. Temple 65 Professor of Chemistry at Connecticut College and the author of Glowing Genes, the first popular science book on jellyfish and firefly proteins, Illuminating Diseases, and 3 books for young adults. His writing has appeared in USA Today and the Los Angeles Times, and he's been interviewed and quoted in The Economist, Science and Nature. At Conn, he teaches introductory chemistry, environmental chemistry, and diseases without borders. So again, as I said, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the Q&A. And without any further ado, I introduce Professor Zimmer here to discuss COVID-19 and the state of science. So welcome, Professor Zimmer.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for introducing me. Thank you, everybody, for coming in the midday time and these sort of crazy online Zoom presentations. They're not my favorite, but it's really nice to see all these Conn alums and Commons Associated people come here. So I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you. So we'll jump right into the questions. You wrote your new book, The State of Science, before the COVID-19 pandemic. Would you like to speak a little bit about your book and especially if it's still relevant?
Yeah, so it's called The State of Science. Originally, I wanted to call it The State of Science, Good Science, Bad Science, New Science, Old Science, sort of a play on Dr. Seuss. But the editor changed that part of the title. But that's how the book is arranged. There are parts about good science, bad science, and new and old science. And I think the one thing that the COVID pandemic has done is it emphasizes cracks. So if there are any cracks anywhere because of the stress and all difficulties associated with the pandemic, those cracks become visible, like the supply chains. But in science, there are 2 cracks that I wrote about in the book that have become a lot more visible now. One of them is false or fake news. And the other one is one that most people don't think about much, but that's publishing in science. And they're sort of related to each other in some way. So there have been studies on fake news. They typically divide fake news into 2 types: misinformation, which is information that sort of slipped out by accident. It's an accidental, incorrect fact. And somehow it's got legs through social media and it's carried through. And then there's disinformation, where somebody's purposefully putting out incorrect facts. The most obvious, and one that's not that common anymore, thank goodness, is clickbait, where you get this sort of thing and you say, wow, that's weird, I haven't seen this before, and you click on it, and of course it's all fake, and there's an ad and everything like that. But people also put out disinformation to scare us. And to scare us into either buying some products or changing our view on something. And I guess maybe the most famous study was published in 2018 in the American Journal of Public Health, where they looked at all the anti and pro-vaccination discussions that were out on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. And they went to the really extreme pro-views and the extreme anti-views. And then they tried to find out where they came from. And what they found out was they all came from the same computer center in Russia. And so there was this hub that had over 100,000 different identities, using these different identities to put out there that vaccination gives you autism, you're crazy if you get yourself vaccinated, or putting out there, if you don't get vaccinated, you're a killer, I hate you. So all this horrible sort of information out there, really trying to polarize the American public. And so we see these two types of fake news. Now with COVID, there was an interesting study done of 1 million tweets, and what they did with those is took a computer to figure out how many of them were false. And what they saw was before COVID came to a place, there was this big swell of news about COVID, and most of it, or about 40% of it, was wrong. And so when COVID was in Italy, for example, before it came to America, there was a big lot of news about COVID being in Europe, but nobody really was doing much about it. And so most of it was wrong. And then there were two ways a country could go. So in some countries, that false fake news dropped down. And what happened was the government was listening to experts, but maybe even more importantly, the media was listening to experts. And so in those countries, you found fake news dropping down, and concurrent with the fake news dropping down were the infections. They went down as well. So in New Zealand, in Germany, South Korea, they got the facts right. If you see stuff coming out of Germany on Twitter, most of it's correct. If you look at the other countries, and of course you could probably guess which countries these are, Brazil, America, Britain, what you find is that the incorrect facts actually never stopped. They just carried on going. And what you find was there was no single voice that people could interview. It was just this morning, I was watching NBC when they were talking about Donald Trump testing positive. And they had two experts. One, they were talking to a public health person about Trump's health and his medical prognosis. But this was a PhD, not an MD. And he really wasn't qualified. And then 5 minutes later, they had an MD and they were asking him about public health questions. So the media just is going for more confident people rather than experts. And often experts, when they talk about their own fields, are a little more hesitant, they're more nuanced. And so that's why the TV doesn't really like getting them. So we've seen that, and sort of ironically with Trump testing positive now, the three countries where there have been problems, England, Brazil, and America, the three people in charge have all tested positive, with Johnson, Bolsonaro, and Trump now testing positive. So that's the fake news. I think that's really something I wrote about before. It's more common now with COVID. And then the other one is publishing. So the way a scientist, I'm interested in proteins that give off light. And I use computers to calculate how these proteins do this. And when I get a result, I write it up and I sent it to a journal. And to do this research, your money is paying for me tax dollars. I've had 3 grants of about $300,000 each for 4 years from the NIH. So the tax dollars are paying to do the research. We then go to the journal. The editor looks at it and decides, okay, this fits in my journal, and then sends it to 3 or 4 other experts in the field. And they read it and they decide whether this is right, whether this is correct. If it's right, they send a letter to the editor and say, or an email, and say, yep, this is peer-reviewed, this works. On average, the studies have been done. It takes about 5 hours to do one of these peer reviews. The scientists aren't paid for this. This is what you do as being part of a scientist. Then, when your paper gets published, the university has to pay for this. And it's about tens of thousands of dollars a year for a journal subscription. So the journal business gets the investigator and the government to pay to do the research. The person who writes it does the research, writes it, edits it. Other scientists check it, give it sort of the stamp of approval. This is certified real science. All of these people do it for free. And then the journal publishes it and makes a lot of money. Last year, $25 billion. It's a 40% profit margin. It's more than Apple and Amazon. And it takes a long time. It takes a couple of months to publish something. The reason we publish is because these publications are the sort of currency that prove how good a scientist we are. So when I write an NIH grant, one of the reasons the NIH grants were funded was because of the publications I'd done. If I come up for tenure, I show what publications I've got. If I wanted a job somewhere else, I show my publications. Last year, 1.6 million publications out there. So to make things go faster, there are these things called preprint servers. It's a bit like a Airbnb review sort of place. You put up your 90% done paper on the internet, and everybody can then peer review it. So all the grad students can read it, and they can send you an email and say, well, this is not quite right. And so it gets slightly better. But your work then gets like a rating, like an Airbnb rating as a 4.5. And so other people sort of know, oh, a lot of people have looked at it. Look, it's 1,000 people have rated this, and it's got a good rating. This is worth reading. So, but it hasn't gone through peer review yet. And that worked pretty well. But when COVID came along, and COVID came along in about January, two things happened. One of them was there was a lockdown. And with the lockdown, in Connecticut, for example, people who were working in the lab at Pfizer doing cancer research weren't allowed to do research. So they stopped working. And if you owned a gun shop, an ammunition shop, or a marijuana dispensary, or gave financial advice, that was considered important and you didn't have to close. But cancer research did have to close. Very strange. But what happened was that all the scientists that weren't doing COVID research suddenly weren't doing any research. So a lot of them decided, oh, I'm going to try and do some COVID sort of stuff. Even though they weren't COVID, they weren't epidemiologists or virologists. And they quickly put it out on preprints. And suddenly there were tons and tons of paper. And most of them were absolute crap. But nobody knew that. And so journalists would see these things on preprints with really inflammatory titles or abstracts, and they would publish them. So it sort of showed that the publishing part wasn't working really well, and now with COVID, we saw even more that it wasn't working. So I think those are sort of two of the main areas where we saw something before COVID, and now it's even worse.
Absolutely. So in terms of relevancy, I would say certainly relevant. The next question that we had wanted to talk a bit about were Nobel Prizes. So the Nobel Prizes are being announced next week, and I see that you wrote about the Nobel Prizes and that you attended the Nobel Awards. Why are these awards so important?
Yeah, so attending Nobel Prizes an experience. It's like the Oscars, the Academy Awards. Everybody who wins an award can invite 16 people. Everybody who comes lives in the same hotel, the Grand Hotel in Stockholm. You walk in and you go, there's a gauntlet of paparazzi taking pictures and TV. It's a huge, huge, big deal. It's a whole week of ceremonies, and it's broadcast live in Sweden and Japan. So in Sweden and Japan, it's as big as the Academy Award. For scientists, it's really the biggest recognition, right? Everybody has heard of that. And so once scientists win an Academy Award, if you walk through the chemistry departments, pretty much, I'd say a tenth of all the chemistry departments, they have posters on the walls of the people who've won Nobel Prizes. Chemistry grad students know who's won the prize. And so they've got an image now, they're idols. And so that's really important. Now, the big problem is, since 1901, when the first Nobel Prizes were awarded, only 3% of the prizes have gone to women. And not a single prize has gone to a Black scientist. So this is in medicine, physics, and chemistry. Those are the three areas of science that get Nobel Awards. So really what that means is there've been no role models out there. And so to me, that's a really big problem, and something that hopefully will change soon.
Absolutely. Do you have any predictions who might win a Nobel Prize this year?
Well, after saying all of that, of course, I'm hoping that it's a woman or somebody from an underrepresented group. So I don't really know much about physics and medicine, but in chemistry, CRISPR is probably the big change in chemistry. And Jennifer Doudna is one of the sort of people who brought CRISPR to become an applied method. So I think she's got a really good shot, and I hope she does get a Nobel Prize, yes.
Now, this is a question that we actually have in the chat. Can you speak a bit about who normally receives a prize, understanding that it usually, represents a decade or more of work? And then I'd love to jump into more about CRISPR as well.
So, so the reason I went to the Nobel Prize ceremony was I had written a book about fluorescent proteins, and the book wasn't selling. And I had a student who was doing research with me, and he said, well, what can I do while the computer's calculating? And I said, well, let's do a fluorescent protein website. And so he started a website about fluorescent proteins. It did really well. About 1,000 people a day looked at that site. Even now, it's about 100 people a day still go to that site. And that's 15 years ago. So it's a very popular site. The book still hasn't sold much. But what happened was I got a phone call. So I teach Gen Chem at 8 in the morning. I came back from my general chemistry class to my office, and there was a phone message. So it sort of tells you it's a long time ago. It wasn't cell phone or text or anything, but there was a phone message, and it was this guy, Gunnar von Heide, who said, hi, I'm Gunnar von Heide. I'm from the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. Can you call me back? And so, of course, I first looked on the internet to see who he really was. And I thought to myself, wow, he's a chemist. He's at the University of Stockholm. It's sort of ostentatious to say he's with the Royal Academy. But I called him, and then it actually turned out that the way it works is there's a committee of chemists, all Swedish, and they get nominations. So anybody who's won a prize, anybody who's part of the academy in Sweden, can nominate a chemistry prize. And it's not a person, it has to be a discovery. And so somebody had nominated fluorescent proteins, and they saw my website, saw that I didn't work with any of the people that were really the top people. And what they wanted me to do is come and testify. So then they call in a couple of people to come and testify. And for a couple of days, you get interrogated by this committee about the subject that they're thinking about for an award. And then the whole academy meets and they say, we think this should be the award, and they give it to, in the case of fluorescent protein, it was pretty obvious. I mean, I think CRISPR will also be pretty obvious that this is going to get the Nobel Award in a couple of years, but they can only give it to 3 people. That's one of the rules. So the really hard part is to decide who those 3 people are. So the Nobel Prize is actually never given for a body of work. They could be the best chemist who's done a whole bunch of interesting stuff, but none of it's really been a big chemical breakthrough. So you have to make that breakthrough. And sometimes some people have just done one thing, but they were involved in a big breakthrough. And so that's how it's decided. And then they award the prize. A lot of it is a little political. And yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, in the past, they didn't look at, so they often ignored women. So there are a lot of, Lisa Meitner is probably the most famous of the physicists. Her advisor, she got the idea, she did the work. The advisor then wrote it up, Otto Hahn, and he got the prize, but she didn't. And I don't think that would happen today, but there was a lot of that.
Absolutely. So going back to what we were talking about with CRISPR. So in the State of Science, you have a chapter about CRISPR. So why is this technique worth a Nobel Prize? Are there any dangers associated with CRISPR? And can you talk a bit more about what CRISPR is?
So CRISPR is actually a bacterial technique that bacteria use to defend themselves against other bacteria and viruses. And so what they'll do is, if they're invaded by a virus, they'll cut a piece of the virus's DNA out. And once they've invaded it, they keep this like a mugshot of the virus. And then forevermore, they have this mugshot circulating in the body. And whenever they find a match to it, they know, hey, this was a virus I had a fight with once before, I'll kill it. And they cut its genetic code, its RNA. So in CRISPR, what people have done is they figured out, oh, we can use this technique that bacteria use to defend themselves to edit DNA. So before, editing DNA was a very tedious and slow process. So 5 years ago, if you wanted to edit some DNA, especially if it wasn't a species that, like an axolotl, that hadn't been done much before, it would take like 5 years, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was like typing a book. If you made a mistake, you had to go back to the page before. Now with CRISPR, what you've got is like a word processing program. It can go to the DNA, it can find exactly the piece you want, take it out, replace it with something. It's dirt cheap. Could do it for about $100, and you could do it in a couple of weeks. So what previously took a PhD thesis, now an undergrad can do. So that's what CRISPR is. It's like a word processor of life. So what can you do with it? Well, obviously you can use it in a lab a lot, but I think most people are always interested in medical things. So sickle cell anemia is a disease that originated in Central Africa. And it originated because people who had sickle cell anemia were immune to malaria. They couldn't get malaria. The only problem is if both parents have a sickle cell anemia mutation, then the child will get sickle cell anemia, and that's very, very painful. Organs are weaker, and they die decades earlier than they would normally. Now, it's all caused by one mutation, just a single mutation. And so with CRISPR, you can change things, right? It's like a word processor. You can go into my text and say, oh, crap, I spelled that person's name wrong. Go and find the name and change the spelling. Well, that's what you can now do with the DNA. So Victoria Gray is the first patient. Normally, we don't know the names of the people, but she has sickle cell anemia. And what they did is they took bone marrow out of her spine, genetically modified it with CRISPR so that it made fetal hemoglobin, so the hemoglobin that babies have. And they put it back in her. And the bone marrow indeed has made fetal hemoglobin. And for a year, a bit more than a year now, she's been without symptoms. And so they've now started doing that with a second person. So those two people, and then there are three other in different disease, where it's just one little mutation, and so you can change it. So that's really cool. The dangers, of course, are that we can now use that and change other things. So there's I don't know if this would be one of them, but myostatin is a gene that controls muscle growth. And there's a biohacker, somebody who does genetic modifications in his garage, who has already taped himself on Facebook, injecting himself with a virus that's been CRISPRized to suppress the myostatin, and which would make him more muscular. Now, it hasn't worked, but there are actually people trying to do this. And so there's a danger of people trying to improve themselves, but also clinics coming up, trying to improve people. And so I think what we'll find in 10 years from now is that there will be clinics that, if you've got in vitro fertilization, will change the embryo so that it's there are a number of genes that only require one small change. For example, that there's a gene that makes your oxygen uptake more efficient. And so what that means is you wouldn't get tired that quickly. You could run faster and so on. And so that would be an obvious genetic modification. And so I think what we might find is that the rich will actually not only have more, but they'll actually be able to improve themselves genetically. So that's pretty scary. There's also something called a gene drive, where you can genetically make a species implode. And so you could wipe out one species of mosquitoes or ticks. But if something goes wrong,
right,
it's really dangerous. And I think the more powerful a technique is, the greater the risk associated with it. I think we saw that with nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is really great. It gives a lot of energy, fairly clean. But boy, if something goes wrong, it goes wrong bad. And so I think that's part of the problem with CRISPR as well.
That's fascinating, truly fascinating. And as you said, there's so much good that can come out of it, but you know, there's a dark side too. So thank you for telling us about CRISPR. You teach a first-year seminar called Diseases Without Borders. Could you tell us a little bit about that class?
Yeah, so there's this program called Semester at Sea. It's basically a cruise ship that goes around the world. And you have to teach courses that are relevant to all the ports. And I have been on it 4 times, and I was actually, right now, I'm supposed to be on the ship between Ghana and Cape Town, but obviously that was a no-go. And so the courses all have to be relevant to the ports that you go to. And so I teach an environmental chemistry class there, which looks at all the different ports and the environmental problems. And this course, Diseases Without Borders, which of course now is very, very appropriate. And so when the trip got canceled, one of the first things I did was convert this course into a freshman seminar. So I've got 18 first-year students now, and we're sort of looking at diseases. And it's called Diseases Without Borders. And one of the diseases we look at is actually fake news, because in many ways it works just like a disease. It spreads very, very fast, and it goes from one place to another, and it builds on itself. But we started with the plague, and so the plague moved very slowly. It took years and years to move from one place to the other, because, well, the fastest thing you had was horses and boats. So things couldn't travel that fast. But now, with airplanes traveling all over the world, diseases just spread so much faster. And so that's sort of, the class is all about different diseases. Right now, actually, this 2 weeks, we're talking about malaria and DDT, the different medications you get from malaria, and where malaria is found, and how the mosquitoes, sort of interesting fact, it's only the female mosquito that bites. Normally mosquitoes feed on plant nectar, and the female that's pregnant needs the hemoglobin in your blood to nourish the eggs, and that's why she bites. And she bites, and when she's done biting, she can weigh 3-4 times her body weight. And then she goes and lands against the wall. And when she's sitting there, what she's doing is letting all the blood sort of sink down to the bottom, and then she expels all the liquids and just keeps the hemoglobin, the parts that she wants. And that's when you can whack her, right? Because she's flying so slow, because she's now full of the blood.
That is fascinating. And so the males can still exist and thrive and survive without biting? So we're only getting bitten by the females?
Only pregnant females.
What? And pregnant females? So not even just a standard female, it has to be a pregnant female.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, if, as your class is a little bit different this year, what does it typically look like when you're actually out to sea? Is it a true 6 months at sea?
Yeah, 110 days at sea. And so the last time we did it, we went to Senegal.
Wow.
And so I had a 2-day field trip, which was done with Harvard Med School and Peace Corps. And they had a malaria information station in Senegal. And so we went there for 2 days, and we learned all about how they were dealing with it there. And for the rest of the time, when the ship is between ports, every day there's a class. And so it was just like a class that I have now. And then once you're in port, you're free to do whatever you want, except each class has a field trip that's associated with the class. And that, again, is relevant to the classes you're taking.
That sounds incredible. Now, I recently read an editorial that you wrote about COVID-19 and climate change, and it was called "The Coronavirus Came Quickly, Climate Change Comes Slowly, These Are Both Deadly." And so I presume it's related to the material in your book. Could you talk to us a bit about the relationship between COVID-19 and climate change?
Yeah, so obviously there was no COVID in the book because it wasn't there yet. But climate change merits a whole chapter, in part because it's one of these strange things where a person's political belief and outlook actually defines whether they believe in climate change or not. That seems to be one of the biggest determinants on that. But if you look at the two, COVID and climate change, that there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. So let me just, I know I have it on my computer somewhere here. 1896, Arrhenius, who is a very famous chemist, first mentioned the fact that climate change was going to occur, that it was occurring because at that time really everybody was burning coal, and that the coal was giving off carbon dioxide, and this was causing climate change. So, I mean, we've known about climate change for a long, long time. COVID is much quicker. We've just learned about it in January. But both COVID and climate change really rely on an agent that we can't see. We can't see the virus. We can't see the carbon dioxide. I think if the virus was visible, it would be so much easier to get people to wear masks because we could see a fluorescent little dot floating around, right? And so we would put a mask on, but we can't see the virus. And so it's very difficult for us to understand things that we don't see. And so in order to do this, to be socially distanced, to put on masks, things that we aren't used to, we have to believe the science. And it's the same with climate change, right? There's this gas, it's released. Boy, I'm breathing it out right now. If it stank, we'd immediately do something about stopping this release of the carbon dioxide, even though stink is not half as bad as climate change. But because it doesn't stink or it doesn't have a color, we struggle with how to deal with it. So I think in both cases, to deal with climate change, to deal with COVID, we have to trust in science. And so that's really important. In both cases, to efficiently deal with it, we have to change the way we live. Right? We've seen this with COVID. There's a lot of stuff we don't do. It's really interesting when you watch a film from a year or so back and you think, oh, don't do that. Oh, kids, okay, that was a long time ago. You can get close to each other. So with climate change, we're going to have to change a lot more. It's not something that scientists are going to be able to solve. They might be able to help, but there's no way we can suck up carbon dioxide enough. So the only way really to deal with climate change is to change our lives and to live more sustainable lives. And again, the only way we can do that again is if we trust the scientists that what they're saying is true. So I think in both cases, that's very similar. But the big difference, of course, is that COVID was here in January, was really, really quick. And I feel with climate change, it's a bit like that sort of fable where you have a frog in hot water and the water gets hotter and hotter and then boils and the frog doesn't realize it. I think climate change in some ways, that's what the situation we're in. From 1896, Arrhenius won the Nobel Prize in 1903. So from that time, we've known about climate change and it's just crept up on by us. So that's really difficult. Another big difference is with COVID, to get rid of COVID, pretty much every country in the world is going to have to work together because China has pretty much solved COVID for now. But if somebody comes from Brazil back to China and has COVID, they're back to the start. So all the countries really are reliant on working together. They might not realize and they might not do this, but at some point, every country is going to have to help the weakest country get rid of COVID if they want to get rid of COVID. with climate change, there are about 5 to 10 offenders at the most. And so if you can get the really America and China and Europe to agree on that, you're pretty much okay. But the problem is really the small countries who are going to be affected the most can't do much. So that's sort of what this article was about.
Thank you. And are there any ways, I mean, you know, of course, if you're not sure, that's okay too, but are there any ways that you would recommend that we can all make small changes in our own lives to live more sustainably?
Well, I think the biggest one is just be aware of everything. So the two obvious ones that are always mentioned, one that really makes my life very, very difficult, it's fly less. You know, flights really leave a big footprint. And the other one, as a South African carnivore, I've really cut down on meat and eat more chicken and fish and try and eat more vegetable. So the meat, just the meat production produces a lot of carbon dioxide as well. So those are probably the two big and easy things. Obviously a smaller car, try and push for solar and renewable energies. But that has to come on a bigger scale. So that's really a question of voting for things and getting in an administration that will put in solar power, wind power, and try for renewable fuels.
Absolutely. Thank you. And, you know, that was the kind of the highlights of the questions that we had wanted to really cover. To our attendees, I welcome you to enter any questions that you have in the chat. There were a few that were submitted in, you know, our registration form that you actually already covered about climate change. But as we wait for questions to come in, is there anything else that you would like to touch on about, you know, COVID-19, your new book, your writing process, any of that?
Well, the new book has been really interesting because I was going to write a book for Oxford University Press. And then we got an offer from this other publisher for a much broader press with a really gung-ho editor, but then the book got bought up, the company got bought up, and then with COVID, everything got stopped. So it's had a really strange and difficult birth.
Absolutely. Now we do have one question. Great question. How would you go about trying to persuade someone who isn't convinced about the dangers of COVID?
Well, this is really, so there's this term in math and science, a wicked problem. And wicked problem isn't a Massachusetts wicked. Well, in some ways it is, but a wicked problem means that there are so many parts of it that are meshed together that it becomes nearly impossible, if not impossible, to solve. And this is one of the problems with COVID, right? Is that some people test positive and are asymptomatic. Some people test positive and they're pre-symptomatic. So that means they're still going to get it. And other people get it and it's like the flu, but then others get it and it's like the flu, but that it just doesn't want to go away. And then other people, especially older people, so my age onwards, you know, it gets a lot more risky. So I think, you know, teaching in person at Con College with students, it's really difficult for the students to see that it's really not themselves, because they're probably not going to get sick, very sick, if they get infected. They might, but the chances are pretty small. But it's the people who work on campus, the chances are much higher that they'll get sick. And also it's so infective, right? I think we'll see this now with Donald Trump, there will be a lot of people in the administration who will probably suddenly be testing positive because this is so infective. But how to convince somebody how dangerous it is, I think you just have to find people that you love and know who are in the dangerous group, and just to realize that your inattention could endanger these people a lot. My parents live in South Africa. My father's 92. They live in what's called a retirement village. It's about 400 houses in an area with just people over 65.
Wow.
But they're incredibly careful. Nobody even now is still allowed to come into the retirement village without being tested and so on. We're a little more lax about that here.
Absolutely. Okay, I have a couple more questions for you. First, what recommendation do you have for recognizing and avoiding fake news?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It's a changing target. 6-7 months ago, I would have said anything on the FDA or the CDC website is not fake. But now I think political pressure, it's not fake, but it might be skewed in some way that I really don't like. So I really like Twitter a lot. And I follow a lot of people that I know are good scientists. And so I think the same goes with publications. If you have a bunch of publications in which you trust the journalist, I think even New York Times, CNN, Fox, there's a lot of false information that comes out through them. But there are some authors that really do a good job. But it's really hard to find out. In fact, I've got a contract now with a young adult publisher to write a book with rules. When is something fake and how can you detect fake science? So that's my project that I'm working on right now.
We'll stay tuned on that. Next question. Could you please provide insight about the process where different countries hire only 1 or 2 different independent pharma companies to prepare a vaccine, and how that information can be shared internationally?
Yeah, of course. So that's the big problem, right? We have many companies all trying to find vaccines. A lot of these companies are doing it because they're profit, right? They're companies, that's what they do. And so they have to pay their researchers. And in part, they do this by getting money from, for example, the United States in advance. So if they get a vaccine, then the United States gets first dibs. The problem there really is what I had said before, is solving the COVID problem in one country isn't going to solve it globally because it'll just come back. The big issue with the vaccine is we're probably going to have to vaccinate a couple of billion people. And that's a lot of people. And if we did it logically, what we'd find out is where can we get the most bang for our buck? Where can we most efficiently set up a herd immunity with the vaccine? Most of these vaccines probably won't work for the elderly. It turns out that vaccines typically don't work well with people in their 60s and above. So the elderly who are actually at the most danger with COVID will have to rely on the young being vaccinated. And so that's going to be very difficult. Just another difficulty is that vaccines have to, most of them, not all of them, but by far most of them have to be kept in the cold. So how are we going to vaccinate 80-90% of the country if we store it in the cold? Are we going to have enough equipment? We're going to run out of equipment. Simple things as injections and freezers.
Right. Can you elaborate a bit on what you said about maybe them not being as effective for this 60 plus group? Why is that?
So vaccines work on you getting either a dead version of the virus or a fragment of the RNA from the virus. And then your body builds up immunity against that. And so then when the real one comes along, you've already got the immunity. Well, it turns out the older you are, I know, if I hit my leg, it hurts for longer. I can't run as much. And it's the same with my immune system. My immune system just isn't as good as it used to be. And so you put this in here and my body says, yeah, so what? It's not worth my effort. And when I was in my 20s and 30s, my body would have said, hey, I'm going to beat you up. But yeah, so the vaccine just isn't that efficient.
That makes sense. This question, I feel like, is very relevant, not only to Connecticut College, but to other institutions and universities. So, you know, Connecticut College has been very transparent about all of the efforts that they've been doing to safely bring students, faculty, staff back to campus. How do you feel that we are doing about the current COVID situation at Connecticut College, especially compared to other schools who are tracking much higher than we are? Do you think that the preventative measures that we've been taking have been effective?
So I have to say the staff has been absolutely hard at work and done really a good job. Victor, as well as the Dean of Students especially. So, and Sarah Cardwell. On testing, I think the fact that we get tested so often, I get tested twice a week, that gives me a lot of confidence. And then the fact that we also have contact tracing. So 4 students tested positive this week. And you know, that was a high number for us. But immediately with contact tracing, they found out who those students were in touch with. They went into transitional housing, which is quarantine. The people, the ones who were in touch with them, the people who actually tested positive go across the road to the ridges, and that's where they are in isolation. So the school has done a really great job. Now it's been a little easier than other places because Connecticut has been pretty low numbers and we aren't in a big city. So, you know, my daughter goes to Tulane in New Orleans, and yeah, you're in New Orleans. Louisiana isn't doing so well, and it's a bigger place. So it's a little easier for us. But yeah, I mean, I go to college 4 times a week. I teach. I'm quite happy and fairly confident that, you know, last week I saw a few students with their masks down here, but they've been really, really good. I think everybody's doing well. And then you compare it to places where you have fraternities and athletics, where there just is so much mixing, and it's so much easier if somebody is infected to infect a whole bunch of people.
Absolutely. And I think that you made a really good point earlier when you were saying, you know, what if COVID-19 was fluorescent and we could all see it and you could really see it in the air? You'd be so much more apt to wear a mask. And it's challenging, I think, for many, especially our young people who are excited to be together. They're excited to be at school. But I also have full faith that they know what's at stake and they want to be on campus. So they're willing to take the precautions. So thank you. I'm looking at the clock and I think we have time for one more question. Okay, this is about CRISPR. So what are your thoughts on selecting against embryos that carry mutations that cause devastating diseases? For example, BRCA mutations, cystic fibrosis mutations, etc. Or could you use CRISPR, maybe not or, could you use CRISPR to correct those mutations?
So I think at the moment, most of the emphasis is on diseases in which there's just one mutation, like cystic fibrosis, but also ideally in which you can take a fluid out of the person, genetically modify it, and then put it back in. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot easier than going into an embryo and trying to genetically modify it in the embryo. Now, I'm sure that's going to come soon. And with cystic fibrosis, that's really the only way of curing cystic fibrosis, will be something like that. And so, I think that's definitely is going to be happening. Now, CRISPR, of course, is also being used. Our tests, our COVID tests, are CRISPR-based COVID tests. It's just used everywhere. It's just like a word processor. You can use it on pretty much everything. And just like a word processor, you can use it to write the most beautiful poetry or the nastiest, horrible email. And most people don't write those hot, nasty, horrible emails. But we don't really have anything in place to prevent, at the moment, people doing stupid things with CRISPR. And I think that's actually the biggest fear. Jennifer Doudna, who was the person who came up with the idea of using this as an editor, genetic editor, she said numerous times her biggest fear is that somebody's going to get ahead of the herd and do something stupid, and then everybody is immediately going to say, whoa, that's dangerous, stop. And all the good stuff is going to have to stop. And including these sort of CRISPR modifications of mutations that lead to diseases.
Thank you. And looking at the clock, it looks like it's time for us to wrap up. Millie Nygren wrote in, and I echo this sentiment fully. Marc, I always appreciate your point of view and hope, and you always present yourself so well. I wish you had been there when I majored in chemistry, Millie, class of 56. So I echo that, Millie, and Professor Zimmer, we really appreciate you being here with us today. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope that everyone else did as well. I am going to share the cover of your book for folks as they're signing off for the day. Any questions that were unanswered, I will share them with you, Professor Zimmer, and perhaps we can do some one-off connections. But any closing thoughts from you?
Well, first of all, thank you to Millie. Millie comes and sees us in the chemistry department every now and again, so that's great. Yeah, if anybody has questions you want to email me, just mzim, M for Marc, ZIM for Zimmer, @concol. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again. Everyone, thank you for joining Fall Weekend at Home. We'll be back at both 3 and 4 p.m. Marc, I will share the cover of your book now for anyone interested, okay?
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.